All right, welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm Ronaldo Diaz. I'm your Lake Worth Waterkeeper. We're pretty excited about this. Well, excited maybe not be the best word for this because this is a really necessary and important webinar that we've put together. It's something we've been planning for a while, actually, to address or rather to provide the understanding of the complexity of our watershed, and we'll get to that in a second, but timing is critical, as they say, and recently, obviously, the headlines have been dominated by West Palm Beach and South Palm Beach, drinking water supply being contaminated with cyanobacteria, and we hope that this webinar really highlights the importance of why this issue should be one of your top issues that you're thinking about, that you care about. And we hope that at the end of this, everyone who's watching will come away with a better understanding of why this is happening, why the Lake Worth Lagoon and its watershed, pretty much all of Palm Beach County, is something that needs to be looked at and understood in terms of its role in the greater Everglades ecosystem. So that we can go ahead and get started. So I founded Lake Worth Waterkeeper in late 2017, pretty much specifically in response to this problem. If you remember back in 2016 and even a couple years before then, we endured what was known as the lost summer. And that was when Lake Okeechobee takes on its super bloom of cyanobacteria, and that cyanobacteria being discharged with Lake Okeechobee water made its way all the way to the spillway right on the Lake Worth Lagoon. And it was and is a severe environmental problem that really needs to be addressed. And so that was one of the main reasons why I even started this organization. So since the beginning, this is something that has piqued my interest. A little bit background on me. My background is actually in law. I specifically went to Nova Southeastern Law School, where they had a really prominent Everglades law, environmental law program, because I saw what was happening to our watershed. I used to be a guide many years ago, and I wanted to take a more direct approach into solving this problem. And I felt that my best role would be as an advocate and using law on our side. We are a member of Waterkeeper Alliance. If you're not familiar with that organization, it's an international organization of 350 or so members. Each waterkeeper around the world is named after their watershed. So ours, of course, obviously named after Lake Worth Lagoon, but we're not alone in Florida. In Florida, we have quite a few waterkeepers that I work together with on many of these issues. For statewide issues, there's even been a couple of new additions to this list in terms of Peace River about here, and then Kissimmee River up the middle of the state. So waterkeepers were pretty important. And if you have family elsewhere in the country, in the state, in the world, likely there's a waterkeeper in their watershed as well, doing very similar work and filling a void that really is needed in the environmental community. So cyanobacteria, this photo I took at the start of about a month ago, probably beginning of May. I mean, I want to say probably May 1st, honestly, was when this happened. Cyanobacteria made its way all the way to the S-155 spillway, which, if you're in the area, that spillway is the boundary between Lake Worth and West Palm Beach. You can see it from Dixie Highway. It's the last structure that connects Lake Okeechobee to the Lake Worth Lagoon. That'll make more sense in just a few minutes. But when these signs popped up, this ominous red sign that says health alert, I really, my phone really just started blowing up since then. I've been getting loads of calls, loads of emails, lots of messages asking what is going on, should we be concerned, what can we do about it? And yes to all of those questions. But let's start with the basics. I want to focus this webinar mostly on how the water makes its way through our watershed. Because when you understand how the water makes its way through our watershed, it really comes together, the understanding of where these environmental problems are originating from, right? Short answer, it's pollution. Pollution drives a lot of these issues, especially cyanobacteria, and understanding where the water moves, how it moves, who's deciding on how it moves, and so on and so forth, gives you the understanding of where and why these problems are happening. So that's going to be the main focus of this webinar. I don't want to dwell too much on the health impacts of cyanobacteria. I certainly am going to talk about it, but I'm just going to introduce it because microbiology, as you can imagine, is incredibly complex and there's a lot to learn. There's actually a lot we need to learn from cyanobacteria as it is. But, why is this a risk? Well, cyanobacteria, first of all, I want to point out, don't look at cyanobacteria as the enemy, right? It is trying to hurt us, it seems like, but cyanobacteria is a incredibly interesting organism. There's many different types of them, many different species. They are just really interesting in terms of science. There's a lot we still need to learn about them. There is, just so much about them that makes them interesting. For example, they're some of really the oldest organisms on the planet. And if you remember maybe back in your middle school days, you probably learned about how planet Earth started with this primordial soup. And from there, life was created and our atmosphere was created. Well, likely the organism that created our atmosphere was cyanobacteria. And that's because these bacterium, they're really good chemists. They can do a lot of things. They can photosynthesize. So that's why some people, you might have heard them incorrectly called blue-green algae. We like to call it what they are. It's cyanobacteria. They're a bacteria. They're not an algae. They're similar to some ways with algae in that they can photosynthesize, but really the similarities, they take away from what they actually are as an organism. They're really good chemists. They've probably created our atmosphere, but unfortunately, some of the species can also produce some incredibly toxic compounds that really hurt us and the environment. In Lake Okeechobee, which is really the driver of cyanobacteria blooms throughout the greater Everglades ecosystem. And by the way, this isn't a Florida problem. This isn't even specifically an Everglades problem. Cyanobacteria blooms are happening worldwide, nearly worldwide. It's driven by very common factors. It's driven by climate change. It's driven by nutrient pollution. It's driven by the loss of habitat. So this isn't really exclusive to our area. This is something that nearly the entire world has to deal with, unfortunately. But there are ways of addressing it and fixing it, and we hope to kind of start you off with a better understanding towards that. So in Lake Okeechobee, for our purposes, for the greater Everglades ecosystem, in Lake Okeechobee, the dominant species that we're generally concerned about is Microcystin aeruginosa. And that's what you see right here. This is a microscope image that I took a while ago from one of my samples. And even though it's in the background, you can almost clearly see that it's almost exclusively all this bacteria. This is Microcystis aeruginosa. They're little round things. And when you look at a drop of water, what we mean by the dominant species, that you drop a single drop of water in a slide, you look at it in a microscope, and the vast majority of what you're going to be looking at is that dominant species. And generally in Lake Okeechobee, that dominant species is this. So this is what our slides look like. And then in other areas, you'll see other types of organisms mixed in. And when they take over like this, and there's so much of it, they really start going into overdrive and they really start producing some toxic things. Microcystis aeruginosa, it can create neurotoxins, hepatotoxins, just like most cyanobacteria. Two of them that we're really concerned about with these bacteria is something called BMAA. It's an amino acid that we have linked to neurodegenerative diseases like ALS, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. That's really because amino acids, our bodies, we need amino acids in our body. There's probably something like, I don't know, 6,000 or so different amino acids that we know about on the planet or in the universe. Our body probably only needs less than 20 of them. And what BMAA does is it kind of tricks our body or our brains into thinking that it's one of the ones that we need, and it takes up a spot on one of our neuroreceptors and basically makes that disconnection in our brain. Hence why neurodegenerative diseases are linked to BMAA. Another toxin that we regularly test for, which is the most common from this species, is called microcystin LR. This is a hepatotoxin, which means it attacks our liver. Not so much, there is a limit where a single exposure can do significant damage, but generally what we're concerned about, just like most other cyanotoxins, is repeated and long-term exposure. And this can be done through many ways. Research has been done on this species that has pointed out that you could be 20 miles away from an affected water body and you can be breathing this stuff in, because wind will kind of whip it up on the surface of the water and it will carry it pretty far. So the hot topic right now, cylindrospermopsin, CYN, sometimes it's called for short. This is what is found in Clear Lake, which is the source of drinking water for West Palm, Palm Beach, and South Palm Beach. If you live in those communities, this is the reason why you need to stay away from your tap water, because this is what's found right now. And perhaps unironically, this toxin was first discovered in 1992 in Queensland, Australia, after people were getting sick, and they figured out that the mystery illness that the people were getting from their drinking water was actually a cyanotoxin, which they ended up calling cylindrospermopsin, because at that time, the species that they found was this right here, Cylindrospermopsis risiborski. Don't worry about the name, obviously it doesn't matter. But these toxins are not just that's where the name comes from, but this toxin is not only produced by this species, it can be produced by a number of cyanobacteria species, including Lyngbya walleye, which is something that is pretty common in South Florida and throughout the Everglades ecosystem. Lyngbya is the cyanobacteria that if you ever go to a pond or an estuary and it almost looks like the bottom is furry and brown, and sometimes it lifts up into mats and floats on the surface, that's Lyngbya. Symptoms from cylindrospermopsin, they include fever, headache, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, hepatomelalgia, this is basically the enlargement of the liver, kidney damage, and something that's interesting about this is there really isn't reliable data available on how much exposure is needed to induce these symptoms. In fact, all of the research that we have when it comes to the public health impact on this cyanotoxin specifically really only comes from studying this species. So the impacts that we have or that we understand from this cyanotoxin comes from the research that's being done on the cylindrospermopsis species and not Lyngbya and others. So we're kind of deducing what kind of exposure is safe for humans. But generally, I would say when it comes to cyanotoxin, anything above 0 exposure is enough to cause serious concern. All cyanotoxin exposure is done by ingestion, right? If you're eating fish that are living in this stuff, cyanotoxins do a process what we call bioaccumulate. They just grow in our bodies, they accumulate and become more and more of a problem the longer we're exposed to it. Hence why I mentioned earlier, repeated exposure is a bigger concern than a single exposure. Breathing it in, like I mentioned, it can be carried by wind and dermal contact, especially through showering or swimming, because obviously, our skin is only such a good barrier in keeping water out of us. We still have eyes, ears, nose, mouth, cuts, scratches, so on and so forth. There's various avenues for cyanotoxins to get into our bodies. And that is really, why this stuff is considered so toxic. It may not kill us from one exposure, but let's say we're exposed to it, on a weekly basis for months at a time, and then for years at a time, then it just starts becoming more and more of a problem, because once it gets in our body, it doesn't generally go away, especially something like BMAA. It really just stays in our body and more accumulates. On that note, I kind of want to, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't plug an event that we have coming up on June 17 at Matthews Brewery, starting at 7. We're actually going to be doing a screening of Toxic Puzzle, which is a documentary by some friends of ours, and it really focuses on a particular lab called Brain Chemistry Labs that are out west. Very innovative. They're the ones who linked BMAA to neurodegenerative diseases, and this documentary really highlights and explains that process on how they figured it out. It's a really interesting documentary. I wish I could say, it's certainly not an upbeat documentary, so maybe it's great that we're having it at a brewery, but watching this movie really you'll come away with understanding how this research is done, and then you're definitely going to understand why cyanotoxins are an incredible risk and something that you need to be concerned about. So June 17 at Matthews Brewery in Lake Worth. You can buy tickets at our website, and we'll be there to answer questions. Of course, we'll be hanging out, and you can come and learn more about the situation. So cyanobacteria, it's a problem, right? But it's not the enemy. It kind of already exists in the planet. But how does it get to us? Well, understanding the complexity of the Lake Worth Lagoon watershed really is the key to understanding why this is such a complicated problem, especially when it comes to Everglades restoration and law, and what we're going to get to eventually, which is the hydrology of the Lake Worth Lagoon. So this map is one of my favorites. It's 1839. It's basically a surveyor's map. You can see kind of the squares, but this is the map that noticeably was the first map to correctly get the placement of Lake Okeechobee in Florida, right? This is obviously before satellites. So in 1839, this was, they really measured everything out, and they figured out where Lake Okeechobee is in relation to, for example, the Indian River Lagoon, which is right here. And then the Caloosahatchee River starts about here. And then right here's Jupiter Inlet, and here is the Lake Worth Lagoon. And what do I mean? What is the Lake Worth Lagoon? Because that's something, that's a question that often many people ask. And so Lake Worth Lagoon, back in the day, was a landlocked freshwater lake. So at this time, beginning of the 19th century, right, people are moving in, displacing the natives, kind of looking at this Everglades system and saying, you know what, we need to drain this Everglades so we can live here. So we really got to change the hydrology of this place, because pretty much everything here in the dark gray area was underwater. But Lake Worth Lagoon at this time was a landlocked lake, and it was freshwater. We actually have historical records, if you can believe it, that say the Lake Worth Lagoon was fed by underground, like underwater springs, right? Like kind of what you see in North Florida, right? Records said Lake Okeechobee was clear with a sandy bottom. And if if you've ever been out to Lake Okeechobee in the last 100 years, you know that is definitely no longer the case. So the takeaway here, beginning of the 19th century, Lake Worth Lagoon was freshwater. I want you to think alligators, lily pads, what you generally think of when you think of the lower Everglades. And then coming with the development, we needed to drain that area. So here's Lake Okeechobee. And for us, what really changed in terms of hydrology is, no longer were we fed by springs and surface wetlands. Now that connection, we need to move that water very quickly out of the area to dry the land so that we can live on it. And so what was built is a system of canals. And these are really the main thoroughways of what connects Lake Okeechobee to the Lake Worth Lagoon. It is by no means exhaustive, because clearly you guys live in the area. You know, we have thousands of canals in your own neighborhoods, and the vast majority of those canals are going to connect to this guy right here, the C51 canal. At the same time, there's another canal that was built up here in North Palm Beach Gardens, the C17. Some people call it the Earman River at the northern end of the lagoon. And down here in Boynton Beach is the C16 canal that spans across and connects to Lake Worth Lagoon. But I didn't include those in those maps because we're going to talk mostly about how we're connected to Lake O, because that's really what's driving this cyanobacteria problem. You see these other two canals, like the C16 especially, it ends right at 441. It does not connect to the refuge, which I'll talk about in a second. It does not connect to Lake Okeechobee water. This canal's sole purpose is to keep the area of West Boynton and Boynton Beach drained and protected from flooding. Similar to North Palm Beach, although that is connected to grassy waters in a way, and there is a capability of sending water that way. But the important takeaway here is this is how most of the water is going to move its way through our watershed, especially these two canals here. The L8 and the L10 canal are really big movers of water. This one also can send water our way, can also send water south. But generally what happens is Lake Okeechobee water is sent down, for example, the L10 canal, and it makes its way throughout the EAA. This is the EAA known as the Everglades Agriculture Area. So remember the survey map, this was all connected to Lake O, and that flow, there was no channelized flow. It was really basically the south coast of Lake Okeechobee just overflowed, and it overflowed into that sheet flow, very wide swath of land that was covered in water, and that's what fed the lower Everglades. So right now that has been disconnected by the Everglades Agriculture Area. And we have a series of canals that move Lake O water now. And this is the only connection to lower Everglades right now, which is water from Lake Okeechobee makes its way down the L10 canal. And a lot of the times it makes its way into this area, which I have labeled the refuge. It's the Arthur R. Marshall National Wildlife Refuge, otherwise sometimes known as Water Conservation Area 1. And this is really the first step or the only connection between Lake Okeechobee to the lower Everglades right now. We're trying to do better. There's in the works right now a southern reservoir down here that's going to do a similar thing. That's going to help move water south so we can clean that Lake O water as best as we can and send it true south to the lower Everglades, which is essentially thirsty for clean, fresh water right now. So that's still in the works, but focusing back on Lake Worth Lagoon, that water that comes down through the EAA, generally what happens, you see these two triangular areas on the map. These are what we call stormwater treatment areas, or STAs for short. They're artificial wetlands. There's pretty much what you'd expect to see throughout most of the Everglades. There's plants in there, subaquatic vegetation, what we call SAV. So if that slips out, just know that I'm talking about plants that generally like to live underwater, and that's what you'll find here. And the first step is water from the lake and from the EAA. What we want is we want these STAs to clean that water and send it south. What's going on right now and why this is a problem right now is these STAs are actually not operating right now. Very little water can be sent into the STAs to go south right now. And that's because this year, these STAs are being rehabbed by South Florida Water Management District. The district, so basically what happened is you can see these lines, the STAs are broken up into what we call cells. And some of the cells are, the bottom has basically caved down, they're too deep. The plants don't like that because the plants want shallow water, because with shallow water, they can photosynthesize and they can do their job of cleaning up the water and sending it south. So they need to rehab this. They're doing that right now. And unfortunately, because they are doing that, they cannot send water south. So then the other option happens. And unfortunately, that means that the water goes straight through the C51 and into the Lake Worth Lagoon. I mentioned it was a lake where it was a landlocked lake back in the day. Right now, it's obviously a coastal estuary, and that happened because around the same time that the canals were built, two inlets were cut into the Lake Worth Lagoon. The main reason behind that was because, keep in mind back then there were no roads, and in order to get boats in, they were literally dragging their boats over the barrier island. And so you can imagine people were kind of sick of it, so they wanted to cut an inlet so that they could just drive their boats right into the lagoon. And so that happened first with the Lake Worth Inlet over by Peanut Island, and then in the 1920s, a few years later, the South Lake Worth Inlet down Boynton was cut. And when that happened, I want you to imagine what it looked like, all those lily pads and alligators, and then all of a sudden you have a really, large influx of salt water from the Atlantic Ocean coming in. So it probably wasn't pretty those first 3 years. It was described as being filled with death, really smelly. That's why the second inlet was cut, was to try and get some better flow throughout the lagoon. And that is what converted it from lily pads and alligators, freshwater, to what it is today, which is brackish, saltwater, mangroves, manatees, and so on. And so we're stuck with it that way, and that's okay. We want to maintain it as a coastal estuary. It is, by all scientific and hydrological definitions, what we call a northern estuaries of the Everglades. It is it is just like St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee, same ecosystem, right? Except unlike St. Lucie and Indian River Lagoon, or the Indian River Lagoon and the end of the Caloosahatchee River, our history started as a freshwater lake. And because of that, we are stuck with kind of broken policy that puts us in a tough place. This is a really important takeaway here too, 42-to-1 input ratio. What that means is for every square mile of water in the Lake Worth Lagoon, there's 42 square miles of the watershed flowing into that water body. To put that into perspective, Indian River Lagoon has a ratio of 5-to-1. Biscayne Bay has a ratio of 11-to-1. Those are more average. So 42-to-1 is really extreme. That means there's a lot of runoff moving into a really small water body. So the margin for error is really thin when it comes to proper water management. So I mentioned our history puts us in a really precarious position in terms of policy. And this is an example of that. We're a coastal estuary, but we weren't always a coastal estuary. And because of that, we get excluded from really important legislation and policy that's out there. One example is what we call NEP, the Northern Everglades and Estuary Protection Plan. All that does is it basically expanded Lake Okeechobee Protection Act, expanded LACO management policy to the northern estuaries. But the takeaway is that, like all laws, the very beginning of the law starts with definitions, and it's flat out says a northern estuary is the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie. It specifically excludes the Lake Worth Lagoon. And that exclusion really gives agencies like the district and the Corps of Engineers almost like an open door to exclude the lagoon from important policy decisions that need to be made and that affect us. The big example of that is going on right now. It's almost closing, is LOSM, Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. And this is a really important policy that is a policy change that is being undertaken by the Corps of Engineers. And the end result of this, which will happen by July, is they are going to propose a management plan for Lake Okeechobee for the next 10 years. And that's going to dictate where, when, and how Lake Okeechobee water is going to be moved throughout all of our watersheds, including the northern estuaries. And part of the problem, and one of the things that I've been working really hard on this, is because of the lagoon's exclusion from federal policy, the project delivery team that's in charge of making these proposals have yet to even mention the Lake Worth Lagoon. I talked about the map. As far as they're concerned, they don't even mention the Lake Worth Lagoon. When it comes to Lake O management, the way they describe it is L8 to tide. So they're talking about it in terms of the L8 canal right here. And then as soon as it gets here, they consider that to tide. And they're really not factoring in the environmental and public health impacts that happen to all of the communities that are downstream from along the C51 canal and the M canal. And we're really going to talk about that. The M canal is really the reason why West Palm Beach, and South Palm Beach, why you guys don't have clean drinking water. So this is a map I've been kind of updating. These numbered tags are all locations where cyanobacteria has been reported, most of them by me. And so we're going to take you, or I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of what do I mean by Lake Worth Lagoon watershed? What does this look like in terms of the water making its way from Lake Okeechobee down these canals? I'm going to focus on the L10 canal and how it makes its way towards us, and how that looks. So starting with number one right here, this is the Pahokee Marina. And by the way, all these photos were taken by me, and they were all taken within the last month. So this is Pahokee Marina. It's right on the Lake Okeechobee, and the marina has been really an interesting observation point in terms of this issue, because every year when Lake Okeechobee has a cyanobacteria bloom, the Pahokee Marina has become the canary in the coal mine, in that the lake water has cyanobacteria. All this is covered in cyanobacteria, but it's at this point in time, it was mostly dispersed throughout the water. It's spread out. And then as it makes its way into the marina, it gets stopped up and blocked up, and the cyanobacteria floats to the surface because they can control their buoyancy, because what they're doing is they're looking for sunlight so that they can photosynthesize, they can get that energy so that they can reproduce and really take over. And that's what you're seeing here, especially in this corner right here. It's kind of like, think of it as a dead end. And what happens is the cyanobacteria ends up taking up so much of the water that it runs out of its own resources and it starts to die. And you can see an alligator here struggling to swim through this stuff. It's really thick. It's kind of like crusty. It's hard to describe. The smell is horrendous. I don't recommend being around it, because at this point, when it starts turning blue and when it's on the surface like this, the bacteria start to die, the cells break down, and all the toxic stuff really starts getting released at a substantial rate, and it starts getting picked up by rain and so on and so forth. This is, of course, in areas of stagnant water, and in areas of open water. This is Lake Okeechobee, a little bit north on the east coast. This is in Canal Point. This is what you generally see throughout Lake Okeechobee. From a distance, it's almost like in areas it almost looks clear, but it's not. When you get close to it, I have pictures of that in Lake Clark, what it looks like. You'll see it spread out throughout the water, and then because of wind and waves, it'll kind of form these bands. It'll collect together. This bacteria has limited movement. It can control its buoyancy, but it can also move in the water a little bit. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to find each other so that it can group together. I have somewhere a slow motion video of it where I put some of it in a beaker in clean water, and you can see the bacteria basically working itself closer to each other. So back to the map, we're gonna kind of, there's no tag on it, but the next photo is gonna be right up here at the start of the L8 canal. This is the headwaters of the Lake Worth Lagoon, or one of the headwaters, this one, and this one. So I'm gonna show you this one, but first we're gonna start with this structure right here that feeds into the L8 canal, and that is the spillway 271, and that's what it looks like. So on the other side of the Herbert Hoover Dike, which is right here, is Lake Okeechobee, and water is making its way through. These are basically culverts, and water is just, Lake O water is just making its way, flowing into the L8 canal towards the Lake Worth Lagoon. This is a little bit down the way, and you can just see, it makes its way. I mean, it's moving down the canal. It has no other choice as a bacteria but to flow with wherever this Lake Okeechobee water goes. So the next one is a really important spot to me. It's right here where this number 2 is. It's called Spillway 352, which is in Canal Point. It is a very important spot for me because this area is extremely popular with fishermen. It's almost hard to talk about sometimes because every time I'm here, there's always people fishing around here, and they're not sport fishing. They're filling up their coolers with fish to take home and eat. And the thing to understand about this community and this structure especially, every year it's subjected to cyanobacteria bloom to some degree. Some years it's worse than others. Oftentimes the community here endures a bloom to some degree for 4, often 5 months out of the year. And we've already talked about a lot of the public health impacts and how repeated exposure really is the problem. Well, this is the community that suffers it the most, I feel like, because every year they get it. You can see, Lake-O, you can see as the water is moving through the spillway, you can just see the cyanobacteria goes with it, and it just flows right in. And this is the L10 canal. You can see the sugar fields because they get irrigated with this water. More on that later. This is the view from the other side. Obviously, it's Lake Okeechobee, and you just see it moving its way. You can see the cyanobacteria definitely likes to go where the water is moving, so it's down the middle. But that it doesn't always look like that. I mean, sometimes when the water is moving really fast, it doesn't really have a chance to get up to the surface. So it stays really dispersed through the water column, spread out, and almost difficult to see. So you can see signs of it along the sides. You can see along the rocks, the way it's kind of like clambering on the sides, looking for still water so that it can start to build up. So moving down the L10 canal, this water, as it moves down, this water, its primary purpose right now, this is why it's important to change, to get involved in LOSM and change that policy of Lake-O management, because right now the priority is not to clean water and send it south to the lower Everglades. Times like right now, which is towards the end of the dry season, the primary reason for sending Lake-O water down these canals is so that the farmers can use it to irrigate their fields, which is fine, but that shouldn't be the priority. The priority should be to protect us from cyanobacteria. First of all, keep it out of our drinking water. That would be a really good priority. Another good priority is to clean that water, send it south, because the Everglades really needs clean, fresh water. And this is what that looks like. Along the L10 canal, like I said, the water is flowing through and it's really collecting on the sides. You can see it blue, it's crusty, it stinks. It's not, it's just not a good situation for any of us. This is one of the structures that the farmers use to water their fields. So off frame right here from the corner, this is, the L10 canal is basically behind us in this corner. This is one of the canals that diverts water out of the L10 canal, and this pump structure sends it down this smaller canal, which is then used to irrigate their fields. And you can see, the cyanobacteria are hard to see in the water column, but once it finds a dead end, it really floats to the surface and does its thing. Here's another similar structure, even smaller version of that last one. These are culverts. You can see a pump here that's used to move water from the L10 canal to this smaller canal. And an important understanding of how they use this water to irrigate is they're not using sprinklers like what you would see in TV and usual farms. What they're doing is they're using this water to literally flood their fields, saturate that soil, and once they're done irrigating, they send that water back into the canal and back into the L10 canal. So anything that they would have sprayed in terms of fertilizer, in terms of herbicides, glyphosate, which is Roundup, or any of the chemicals that they sprayed on their fields, ends up back in the water on top of the pollution that came from Lake Okeechobee, which is there because of 100+ years of intensive farming operation. We call that legacy pollution. Then they just kind of add some more icing on that cake by sending us some more of their irrigated water. You can see that happening here. This is another one of those diversions. you can see the cyanobacteria along the L10 canal here, along the shoreline. And, we all know what water looks like when it moves. This little pump right here is sending water from the fields back into the L10 canal. They just so happen to also be burning this field here to harvest it. That's a whole other webinar. That's a whole other environmental catastrophe that is being done in the Everglades agriculture area, which also releases nutrient pollution into these waters and our air, which end up in the L10 canal, which continues down the way until it reaches us. So, we've gone through the L10, we've covered how they irrigate their fields. So now, like this year, water, we want it to be going south, but that's not happening. So what's happening is it's going down the C51 and the M canal and making its way here. The M canal is really significant because there is no structure. The water just comes right out of the L8 canal. There's no like gate or anything that separates it at this point. They can kind of slow it down there. But I'll show you what the M canal looks like. So this is the M canal in Loxahatchee. Above the frame here, it leads us back to the L8, like I pointed out before, and then to the bottom of the frame, there's a little bridge. Underneath these culverts, the water goes through these culverts to the other side where it makes a turn and heads its way. This is what the other side looks like. This photo was taken just 2 days ago. See, it's clearly filled with cyanobacteria. And this canal makes a right-hand turn. And from this point, in about 8 miles, it goes right into grassy waters. So, like I said, this was taken a couple days ago. The cyanobacteria is still there. The water is kind of being drawn down because it is a dry season. And we're really concerned about that. And so the M canal, what it is doing is it's feeding grassy waters. And I'll do a more detailed shot on that later. So this is really the source of what's feeding the drinking water in West Palm and South Palm Beach. But back to the C51, which is the other route, and they're both interconnected. The C51 is that big canal along Southern Boulevard that we can see along the road there. And it makes its way all the way to number 6, which is Lake Clark. If you're in Lake Clark shores, you've already been seeing this. But again, from a distance, you almost don't see it in the water. But if you look closely along the sides, you can see that crust starting to form because the cyanobacteria is in the water. But since there's a lot of flow through here, it's not exactly too visible. It's spread out. But once you get really close to the water, you really start to see it. It looks like a dirty snow globe, right? It looks like flakes of a snow globe, except they're neon green. And that's kind of what it looks like as you get really close to the water. And then, of course, you find areas like, this is that park that's on the northern end of Lake Clark, right on Forest Hill. It's kind of a dead end because it has all this plant life in here, but there's also a small culvert. So there's not a lot of water flow. So the cyanobacteria really loves this and makes its way into these little dead ends of stagnant water. Does its thing like it did in Pahokee Marina, where it floats to the surface and starts to die and starts releasing its toxic. And that's why it's turning blue here and there, and it just starts getting worse. Then the next stop, almost immediately after Lake Clark, is the spillway dividing Lake Worth and West Palm Beach. This is the 155 spillway. This is the last structure from Lake Okeechobee into the Lake Worth Lagoon. The other side of these 3 gates is the Lake Worth Lagoon. You can see the sign here was knocked over. Right now, the gates are closed. So nothing is really going into the Lake Worth Lagoon right now because it is dry season. But once it starts raining, that's going to start. This was taken a couple weeks ago. You can see it's a really important habitat. This spillway is really popular with fishermen. You can see a school of mullet here. Last week when I sampled here, there was a really big black drum that swam by. Today I sampled. There is a really big snook that like to hang out here, some big jacks. I don't know why I'm saying this because I'm sharing some secret fishing spots. Maybe not so secret, but this is an important spot that really we do not want to be hit hard by cyanobacteria on top of the public health risk. Environmentally, it would be bad too. This is what it looks like during the rainy season. You can see this was taken, I think, in March. Well, not quite rainy season. It was taken in March, but you can see a high flow event. This is what it looks like. The water almost foams up, almost like rapids, because they're sending a lot of water through. And this is really what we're concerned about. I talked about how the priority right now in terms of policy is the priority for sending Lake O water in our direction is to irrigate the sugar farms. And right now, so let's say you add up the numbers coming from these two structures, and it's probably going to come out, it's measured in cubic feet per second. It'll probably come out in something in the 1,000 or plus cubic feet per second. But then on the other end, a few hundred, like 250 cubic feet per second, has been kind of trickling in down to C51. And that's what's sending that cyanobacteria in. But that's going to change when it starts raining. When the rainy season starts, the farmers are going to say, hey, we don't need any more Lake Okeechobee water because we have plenty of rain. And that's the big fear, because if that happens, the lake is still maybe a little bit too high, plus it's raining. So then that water is going to be sent continually, but even more so straight our way, including the M Canal. So I'm going to stop sharing because I want to share another map, and I'll kind of give you a little detailed glimpse of what exactly is happening on the M Canal. So this right here, this is what we call DB Hydro. This is from South Florida Water Management District. This is really an emphasis of how human controlled this problem is, right? Every single dot you see on this map is an important structure, either a spillway, some sort of data collection, monitoring well. There's all kinds of things that we're collecting data throughout the watersheds, and you can see there is a lot, and it really highlights how everything, even where you would think, you know, deep in the Everglades where you think no humans ever go, I mean, there's important structures down there because 100% of our watersheds are controlled by humans. It's in our area, that means South Florida Water Management District and the Army Corps of Engineers, right? So here's those spillways that I mentioned, and the other ones up here. You can see the canals. And you can see how important this connection is to send water south, because there's such a cluster of stations here, because we really need to know how much water makes its way down there versus how much goes down towards us. I'll use a simpler map though, Google Maps, trusty Google Maps. So again, L10 canal, L8 canal, and then here's the C51. But along the L8 canal, we will zoom in to the M Canal. So the water comes out of Lake Okeechobee, makes its way down the M Canal, down the L8 Canal, and then right here in Loxahatchee, the M Canal picks up its water, makes its way up. Here's that bridge. This is where the photo that I shared was from. And then it makes that turn, following the canal through Loxahatchee, continues down into grassy waters, right? And this is why, and we say grassy waters is the surface water source of drinking water for West Palm and Palm Beach and South Palm Beach. And the way that happens is, and why we call it that, is because in South Florida, chances are, especially if you live a little bit out west, most of your water is going to come from aquifer. It comes from underground, except this is kind of the exception. A lot of the water, most of the water is coming from a surface wetland, which is grassy waters, which if you go there, you know, along North Lake, you can go to the visitor center, highly recommended, very beautiful place, great wetland. It needs to be protected. But, you know, it's more, so when we talk about an environmentalism, we want to protect our natural areas. It's more than just, we need to protect our parks and our visitor centers and our animals. We need to protect our drinking water. We need to protect our public health. And this is extremely evident in this watershed, because this is a surface water source in South Florida, which is kind of mind-boggling. So back to the M Canal going in, it makes its way in, and water can, you notice there's still a semblance of a canal going through, right? And so something to understand here, if the water is going slow through here, it'll kind of disperse into the wetland. And the wetland, when we, plants are really good at cleaning up nutrient pollution. That's why we do this. That's why the STAs exist. That's what they're doing. But plants really clean up that pollution, and that's kind of what we try to aim for. Except in times of high flow, like if it starts, during the rainy season, and this water is moving through, or like when they were doing before, the water was moving pretty quickly. And water, when it moves and it picks up speed, it likes to stick to the channels, right? And there's actually really complicated hydrology equations that calculate this. We do it for the Lake Worth Lagoon in terms of figuring out how the lagoon flushes itself. And what we find is that when it comes to flushing and water, the water likes to move where it's deeper. And so it's going to follow this canal. So when water is moving through relatively quickly, or even in other times, a lot of that water almost in a way can bypass grassy waters. And it goes through this canal into Lake Mangonia, which we all probably a good part of the county definitely drives by in traffic. You see that north of Palm Beach Lakes, and then it's connected to Clear Lake, which is where West Palm is drawing their drinking water from. In fact, if we zoom in, we can see the water treatment plant right here, right? So underneath Australian right here, water goes into this little basin. That's where they draw the water in. So Clear Lake, this right here, is where they found cyanotoxins. And this is what made it into the water treatment plant. This is why West Palm Beach doesn't have clean drinking water. Same for Palm Beach and South Palm Beach. Because if you can imagine, the island doesn't really have, it's right next to an ocean. There's no surface water source. The aquifer is really sensitive here because of the salt water. So Palm Beach and South Palm Beach buy their water from West Palm Beach to get piped over to the island. And that's why the three are contaminated. So what's driving this? Well, what drives a cyanobacteria bloom? Like I said, they like to photosynthesize. They like the sun. They love nutrient pollution, which is coming out of Lake Okeechobee, right? Over with 150 plus years of intensive agriculture operation in Lake Okeechobee, on top of what's being added on top of it as that water is used for irrigation. And then, we're not totally innocent too. As that water moves down, especially to C51, there's loads of canals from Wellington and these neighborhoods that connect into the C51, also adding nutrient pollution. But an important takeaway there is I have been doing this for many years and monitoring, and this part of the watershed, right, the eastern part of the watershed, it's very rare for us to get a cyanobacteria bloom compared to the western half. I mentioned how Canal Point will almost get an annual bloom of 4 to 5 months out of every year. Well, for us, it's a very rare occurrence, and the common denominator is that when we take Lake Okeechobee water, like we have been this year, that's when we get cyanobacteria blooms, because the nutrient pollution, especially from the lake, makes its way through and is really driving all of these blooms. It doesn't mean we're totally immune from them. There was maybe 2 years ago, I remember there was a bloom in the C51 canal, perhaps almost ironically, it was behind the headquarters of the South Florida Water Management District, but it really didn't extend beyond a few miles, and it definitely didn't get on the surface like what you see in Lake Clark or Pahokee, and it lasted all of like 3 days. And that's generally what we see maybe every 3 to 5 years in pockets throughout the eastern half of our watershed. There was another one in Lake Osborne that lasted like a day, maybe 3 years ago. And it lasted, a day and went away very quickly. And those are often fueled by maybe some rain with a little bit of runoff, but it's never, not yet, quite the caliber of what we see in Lake Okeechobee. So I hope that covers it. I want to, remind everyone of our movie screening at Matthews Brewery on the 17th. That should be a good event. And if you could join us, I'll be there. We'll be there. And we can answer questions and do more as well. And from then on, if anyone has any questions in the comments, whether on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to ask any questions, and I'll be able to answer them. I see a comment. Yes, 2016, the lost summer. Almost ironic. Another highlight of why Lake Okeechobee is really the driving factor, or why we suspect it's the driving factor, is because if you go back to this map, the structures, there was another lost summer, if you will, in 2018 or a couple years ago. St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee really got it bad then. And we were spared because at that time, the Herbert Hoover Dike in our area was under construction, especially the structure up here. You saw the photo, it looked almost brand new. And since it was under construction, they weren't capable of sending water south, even if they wanted. So again, if you have any questions, I'll stick around for a few more minutes and see if there's any more questions. And I don't really see any, so I'm trying to think of, what else we can cover. And like I mentioned many times, I've done these reports throughout the area, letting DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, know where the cyanobacteria is making its way through our watershed. And they have a map that really anyone can contribute to. If you live on a canal and a lake, you should be participating and looking at these things, because you can send in reports as yourself and to add to this database. Because before I started Lake Worth Waterkeeper, there were no points on the DEP map for these, and that's one of the reasons why I started. So I see a question. What about golf courses and houses in the West Palm Beach Western communities? Don't they add nutrient water to grassy waters? Yes, so they do for sure. Let me stop this share, and then I'll go back to that other map to show that. So these communities, such as Loxahatchee or Western West Palm Beach, there are going to be spots where nutrient pollution is being put into grassy waters, right? So if you remember, here's 441 State Road 7. There is a highly contentious issue that keeps brewing about extending 441 up along Ibis here and to connect it to North Lake. And we're concerned about that because more traffic, first of all, generally means more development, and also more chances of changing the hydrology here to allow for more nutrient pollution to come in. Another area of concern to look in is you look at this basin right here, and when you see water bodies like this, and you can see them pretty much anywhere in the map, generally what that means, especially bigger ones, is the watershed or the basin is going to be flowing into these. So whenever you have an area, like this is a big commercial district, there's Grandview, nutrient pollution certainly can work its way into these water bodies in Clear Lake by that way. Except, again, like I highlighted, that so far from what we've seen, and knock on wood, that kind of runoff, I'll highlight also, Lake Clark Shores. Lake Clark Shores definitely has a lot of houses around, lots of lawns. Some of them go straight into the lake, right? Lots of fertilizer being used. And yet in these water bodies, that are surrounded by suburbia, surrounded by fertilized lawns and septic tanks and old sewer systems and so on and so forth. What we're seeing in places like Lake Clark Shores is it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare to almost non-existent that there will be a cyanobacteria bloom until, like I said, C51 Lake Okeechobee water gets sent into that water body. The other example, which I mentioned earlier, is in the south end of Lake Worth Lagoon. You have the canal here, the C16, that drains all of this, all of these Boynton communities from West Boynton to the Ag Reserve to East Boynton. And even then, it's extremely rare that you're going to see any cyanobacteria bloom in any of these numerous lakes that you see in the area that are just surrounded by what looks like endless suburbia. I see a question in terms of how safe. Okay, is all water flowing into Lake? So I see a question here from Nancy. Is all water going into Lake Mangonia from grassy waters? Likely not, but a good majority of it is, especially during rainy season. Most of the water is going to be coming down through here, except what's happening right now is because they cut off that flow in the M canal. What we're seeing is grassy waters is really low in terms of how much water is in there. It's a dry season, and it's kind of a domino effect. Same for Lake Mangonia, same for Clear Lake. And I heard something, the city of West Palm said because Clear Lake is low, that's why the bloom happened, and that's kind of a half truth. I mean, yes, like driving the lake lower makes it hotter and does get kind of a condition that will make the cyanobacteria bloom, but you can't ignore where the source of that nutrient pollution has been coming from. And for months during the dry season, like I said, that water has been making its way out of Lake Okeechobee, irrigating the sugar fields. And then as it makes its way through at the other end, instead of water going south, we've been getting kind of this slow trickle of the water that they deemed that they didn't have any use for irrigation. So we get the leftovers right now, and that's what's been trickling the nutrient pollution and the cyanobacteria throughout the rest of the watershed. And that will likely change when it starts to rain. Even more water is going to be sent down, those canals. And almost dually, when it starts to rain, these golf courses and the houses around will also be sending their own nutrient pollution. Let's just think about it in terms of there's a fire, and the nutrient pollution coming from suburbia and the golf courses is like throwing a little bit more gasoline on that already burning fire. I see a question, is Rapids Water Park safe now? I believe their water's from West Palm. I would say that's probably, given their location, a very safe assertion that their water is from West Palm. That is a really good question. Honestly, it's a question for the company itself, because it depends on how they treat their water before sending it through the slides and whatnot. I see a spicy question from Lee here. Army Corps of Engineers and South Florida Water Management District allows releases of bacteria-laden water into grassy waters. How did they get away with this? Is this legal? So there is a piece of policy that exists that me and fellow waterkeepers have been working on, lobbying for quite some time. It's called the Regulated Substance List. And this list is a list put out by the DEP. It's a water quality standard, basically. And it has a list of toxic things that we don't want in our drinking water, right? Famously, probably the most famous one on that list is lead. And the things that are on this regulated substance list are substances that need to be tested by utilities and agencies very regularly. They need to do their absolute best and way more than the bare minimum to make sure that these substances don't go into our drinking water supply. And And amazingly in Florida, because Florida is not friendly to environmental regulation, no cyanotoxins are on that list. So theoretically, a lot of these agencies really don't have a duty to even test for these things. And that's part of why we get this really sorry excuse from West Palm Beach in terms of how they absolutely bungled this process in terms of warning Palm Beach and others that their drinking water was contaminated. I'm sure you saw there's lots of news being covered on it, on how they basically knew about it for at least a week. I mean, I can say they knew about it for at least a month, because at the beginning of May, it was like May, 1st or 2nd, around that time, I got the report to DEP that the M Canal, at that time, I basically told them, this is pouring into grassy waters. This isn't no longer a if and when. It was happening at that moment, and something really needs to be done. And I can't really say that, I don't necessarily, it's a touchy subject, but for them to claim that they didn't know about it is suspect, because shortly after that report made it to the DEP map, West Palm Beach did ask the Corps and the district to stop flows from the M Canal into the grassy waters. And why would they ask for them to do that? Because this time of year, grassy waters is pretty thirsty right now. It does need clean, fresh water. It is a wetland. Clear Lake is running a little bit low, just like most of our water bodies, even the Lake Worth Lagoon. So there is a need for clean, fresh water. So for them to specifically ask to stop the flow of M Canal into grassy waters should tell people all they need to know about whether or not, or when they knew that this was going to be a problem. See, question that Singer Island is not affected yet. And yes, I would say that is true. Singer Island does get their water from Riviera Beach. I don't know the details. I think they mostly get their water from aquifer. But I am honestly, I can't, I would say we know for sure. We know this because of previous litigation that West Palm Beach right now, they sell their water to Palm Beach and to South Palm Beach. So if you're in Singer Island, if you're in Lake Worth has kind of an interesting water source. There's like a split, I would say maybe like a 70-30, where 70% of their water comes from aquifer, maybe 30% comes from surface. And so far we haven't seen, or they haven't seen cyanotoxins in the water. I'm not exactly sure if they're testing for it, but it is definitely a valiant question to ask your local utilities. Keep in mind, I like what you said there, not affected yet, right? And that's a really important distinction, because I talked about LOSUM and how important that piece of policy is in terms of how Lake Okeechobee is managed for the next 10 years. If we don't get our way, and specifically what it is, they have offered a number, like half a dozen alternatives or models on how they think Lake Okeechobee should be managed, and pretty much all of them don't result in more water being cleaned and sent south, which is what we want. There's some that we could probably work with and fix up. There's one that is a hard no, and there's an alternative known alternative BB, and that's a hard no because it was literally written by sugar lobbyists. So we can pretty much guarantee that that model just continues to perpetuate that priority, that the priority of the water coming out of Lake Okeechobee is going to be to make sure that they have the absolute primo best best water and irrigation conditions, at the cost of us and our drinking water, because that's really what happens. I can't reiterate that enough. The reason why this is likely happening is because the only reason why water right now during a dry season is coming out of Lake Okeechobee, the priority reason is to irrigate their fields. It's a dry season. They need water for their crops, and they get first dibs. And then we get the remnants, we get the scraps coming out of the other end. And unfortunately, those scraps right now are being contaminated by lake water, by their runoff, and that's driving the cyanobacteria bloom. And we do need water. I mean, I'll point out right now, I do regular sampling throughout the Lake Worth Lagoon, and Every site along the Lake Worth Lagoon, I do about 14 or 13 every week. And as a coastal estuary, in terms of salinity, parts per thousand, we want the salinity to be about 25, low 20s. And for weeks now, all of the sites have been 35 plus, which is basically ocean water, which is not what you need for seagrass. And that is a small scale problem compared to what's the large scale problem in terms of Everglades restoration, because you see the EAA right here has cut off the flow of water into the Everglades. So this was all sheet flow back in the day, and now we just get those little canals, and then we have this connection here, and the result is most of the water kind of comes along this eastern edge, and it's really not enough. The lower Everglades is thirsty, and specifically Florida Bay down here is very thirsty. And when it doesn't get enough clean fresh water, one, the lower Everglades starts to dry out. It's a wetland. We don't want it to be dry. We want it to be wet. And then Florida Bay starts to do what Lake Worth Lagoon is doing, and it becomes what we call hypersaline, which means that the salinity is through the roof. It's saltier than the ocean. And when that happens, seagrass starts to die off. You might remember not too long ago, a few years ago, and multiple times over the last decade, there's been really massive, we're talking about acres and acres of seagrass just dying in Florida Bay. And it's a tremendous loss of habitat, and it's a catastrophe. And one of the main reasons why the solution to keeping our drinking water safe and clean is the same solution to saving our environment and our lower Everglades, right? I mentioned environmentalism is no longer about saving animals and environment. Environmentalism is, yes, it's about that. It's about saving everything that's in the Everglades and the special habitat and, the River of Grass. I mean, if you haven't read that book, you definitely should. Super special place in terms of habitat, environment, and animals. It must be protected. And now we understand that the protection of the Everglades also means the protection of our own health and our own drinking water, because these, losing, like Kimberly just pointed out, 50,000 acres of seagrass in Florida Bay. I'm a fly fisherman. That literally makes me cry. Puts a tear in my eye, because it's a tragedy. Our guides need to make a living. There's a reason why that exists, for many reasons, why you want to save it. But in coincidence, or running along with that reason, is the need to protect our own drinking water. And the solution is the same, whether you want to protect our drinking water and grassy waters, which is also a very special habitat, or you want to protect Florida Bay so that it can continue to be an amazing fishing spot. The solution is the same. And the solution is this. When it comes to LOSM and Lake Okeechobee management, the priority is to clean that water coming out and to get as much of that clean cyanobacteria, nutrient pollution-free water south to the lower Everglades as humanly possible, as close to we can make it to what it was before the EAA existed. And then the other solution is that Lake Okeechobee needs to be managed at a water level that is shallow enough that it encourages plant life to come back, right? So you look at the south end and the west end of Lake Okeechobee, there's still some subaquatic vegetation there, but it's nowhere near what it used to be back when that map was made that I started this presentation with, right? In the early 19th century, there was subaquatic vegetation all around. And if you go, I encourage people to take this drive. It is a beautiful lake. Maybe not now when it's loaded with cyanobacteria, but along this coast, there's no better way to describe it. It's basically a dead zone, right? I wouldn't exactly fish here. It's not what it could be, right? You can certainly catch little catfish and crappie and things like that still, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And once we do that, once we bring that habitat back to Lake Okeechobee, you'll see the dominoes fall. That habitat, those plants will start cleaning up that legacy pollution, just like the STAs clean up the pollution coming out of the EAA. just like the southern reservoir, which is being built down here, will do. All these things are going to work together to get that water clean and moving truly south, instead of sending it our way into the Lake Worth Lagoon, or into the Indian River Lagoon out here, or into the Caloosahatchee River. And I think that's it. I'm not seeing any more comments or questions. Feel free to reach out. We do have a really active social media on Facebook and Instagram. You can also sign up on our website, www.lakeworthwaterkeeper.org. Towards the top, you should be able to sign up for an email. We'll send you events. For example, we have a volunteer event this Sunday at Jewel Steinhardt Cove on the Lake Worth Lagoon, where we are going to work on a living shoreline project that we manage or maintain for the county. Really special place. If you could join us, please do. Our information is on our social media and our website. We'll send out an email. And also, as mentioned before, you can get tickets to our Matthews Brewery event. Might be it's an intriguing movie. It's maybe not the most upbeat, but it should still be a fun night to hang out, grab some beers and answer questions and share information. I see. I love this message. Also donate. If you go to our website, also a ability to donate as well. So yes, please do everything we do. We are a grassroots community-based organization. Everything we do in terms of the science that we do, the litigation, the legal work that I do, it's all donation driven. And let me tell you, science is not inexpensive. The work needs to go on. We need to do the sampling. We need to get these reports and we need to get these comments to the Corps of Engineers so we can continue to make a difference and help the greater Everglades ecosystem. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. We went just a little bit over an hour, and we do plan on having more webinars and similar opportunities to educate on the different issues. This stuff is really complicated. Talking about hydrology, we're talking about microbiology. These are the hardest things that you can study. It's a lot to take in. And then on top of that, our watershed is extremely complicated compared to the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee. So please join us. You can become a member on our website, and we'll have plenty more opportunities to learn, to donate, and to get involved and take action. Thank you.